Hey, this is Dr. Ben Safranski, and I'm here tonight. I want to talk about what's going on with Bishop Strickland and about Pope Francis' removal of him. And especially, I want to talk about some of the theories, the ideas, and the kind of conspiracy theories, really, that are going around about the dismissal. And I want to start off by saying that in issues like this, I don't think that we should take sides. I don't like to take sides on things like this. The people that I run into, it seems like you run into a lot of people. Oh, hey, welcome, Rob, to the live chat. So one of the main reasons I want to talk about this is because of how divisive this event has been in the church, and it really hurts me to see people in the media, commentators, or just people I know kind of taking events like this and trying to run with them to spin their own particular narrative or to sort of like whip up uh, support for a faction or a group in the church. Um, the way I think about the church, I always go back and I think about the first chapter of St. Paul's letter to the First Corinthians, where he gets on the Corinthians about breaking themselves into factions. And what does he say about people, right? What's going on in Corinth? What does he say about people who want to break the church into factions? Right? He says that people in the church of Corinth are saying, "I belong to Apollos," or "I belong to Paul," or "I belong to Peter." Right? People in the church of Corinth, so this is the middle of the first century, are trying to identify themselves not with the church or with Christ, but with particular leaders, particular apostles in the church. And so I always like to look at these issues, first of all, from the perspective of Christ's prayer that we would be one, right? When he prays to the Father in John 17, he says, that I've come that they might be one, right? The people he's gathered just as I am and the Father are one. So, what I like to do with an issue like this is to try to bring like three things to it that I think are sometimes lacking in the commentary: theology, history, and common sense, right? We have become quite partisan in the church in a lot of ways, especially in the online space, right? And when we become partisan, I think one of the things that we start to do is we start refusing to look at the particulars of a given event. We start to categorize people and events. We start to decide whether they belong to our category or not, whether they belong to our group or not, our party. And we take that as sort of like evidence that what they're doing is either right or wrong, good or bad. And we stop looking at the particulars, we stop looking at the evidence. This definitely happens in politics, and I'm susceptible to it in politics, just like a lot of people are. But one thing that I want to do, one thing that I try to do is work really hard to keep that spirit of partisanship out of my approach to the church. So the first thing that I do and that I would want anyone I'm talking to think about is that I refuse to categorize people in the church as either conservative or liberal. Now, that's not to say that like those words don't have some real bearing on people in the church, or that right, that's not to say that like the real meanings of those words don't say something. But The problem, I think, is that when we do that, we're just importing our basically our modern political categories, especially our modern American political categories, into the realm of the church. And I frankly, I don't think that's where they belong. It also makes it really easy for us to say that I'm a good guy and the other guy's a bad guy. Now, categories that I do think are appropriate when we're talking about the church would be orthodox and heterodox, right? Well, what are the definitions of those? Well, to be orthodox means to have right belief, and it basically means that you accept everything that the Catholic Church proposes for belief, right? That you assent to it. Not that you totally understand it necessarily, but that you give it the assent of belief. Heterodox means to some extent you reject what is proposed by the church for belief. Those can be useful categories. Now, um, to talk about Strickland and Francis, I want to start by saying that I have a lot of sympathy with people who are really upset by the removal of Strickland from the Diocese of Tyler. And I have that sympathy because Strickland recently has really come to represent something important in the church, and especially in the American church. Right? What does he uh, represent? He represents orthodoxy, right? Holding that which the church proposes for belief, but not just orthodoxy. He has come to be a symbol, and I don't mean symbol in like a weak way. I mean in a strong way. He is a figure of like vocal and courageous orthodoxy in the American church, and sometimes we feel like we're lacking those, even if we think or we know that most or many of the American bishops are ultimately orthodox. Sometimes it feels like not very many of them are vocal or courageous about that orthodoxy, right? Um, and we really need that. We need vocal, courageous bishops who make it clear that they're going to uphold what the church teaches. And, on a side note, my understanding of Bishop Strickland, which, granted is pretty limited, I don't live in the Diocese of Tyler. He comes across, I think, in the Catholic media as being pretty humble. He doesn't seem to be very self promoting. Okay. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute when I read talk about some things that people have been saying about Strickland lately. So, what what are the media and the commentators saying about Strickland? By the way, if you're watching the stream, say hi in the chat. I'd love to see who's in. Make sure to ask questions. Leave some comments if you have anything that you want to contribute, and I'll get to your questions. So, what is the media saying about the removal of Bishop Strickland? Well, obviously, the question of what the media is saying depends on what media you're looking at, right? Uh, I tend when I'm looking for church news, I tend to go to a couple of sources. I tend to mostly read The Pillar, which you can find at pillarcatholic.com, and I tend to read Crux Now, or Crux, which is run by John Allen. And those sources, I think, are remaining fairly neutral, right? Like just kind of trying to report more or less the facts. At least I think that's what the Pillar is doing. That's how the Pillar, I think, pretty consistently approaches things. But if you kind of pick through the commentaries, you pick through what the media is saying, you can find some pretty wacky stuff. And I found something that is a good example of what I would think of as an extreme reaction to the removal of Strickland. I found this at the Federalist. Now, I want to read for you guys something real quick from this article. If you were to go to the Federalist.com, they posted an article on November 18th, so that's just 3 days ago. And the headline says Pope Francis' removal of conservative Texas bishop exposes more cracks in the Vatican's new agenda. Okay, headline isn't super extreme, but when you scroll down past the picture of Francis looking very grumpy, then here's sort of the byline or the under, the secondary headline to the article. It says the Vatican continues to please the rainbow mafia while mercilessly attacking the Orthodox, the faithful, and the traditional. Okay, so the Vatican is uh, pleasing the rainbow mafia and doing what? What did that headline say? I want to read that again. Mercilessly attacking the Orthodox, the faithful, and the traditional. So what's the implication of that headline? Uh, it sounds to me like the implication of the headline is that Francis has removed Bishop Strickland because he's Orthodox, because he's faithful, and because he's traditional. Okay. Um, Now, one of the interesting things that is going on with Strickland or has gone on recently is that he has gone to Baltimore for the meeting of the US bishops, right? They have this meeting every November in Baltimore. And being despite being removed from the Diocese of Tyler, Strickland actually, because he's still a bishop and he's still American, there's no reason he can't attend the bishops' meetings as a bishop. Um, he hasn't, though. He isn't going into the meetings. What he's done is he's gone and hung around outside the meetings with a group of people. You'd probably call them supporters because I think they're mostly gathering there to kind of show solidarity with Strickland and pray with him. And from what I understand, from what I read, they've been praying the rosary. He's been giving blessings, things like that. Now, the Pillar went there and they interviewed people who were hanging out outside with Bishop Strickland, and they asked them why they were there. Okay, they're there to support Bishop Strickland, and I want to look at some of the reasons that people are giving. I think this is just kind of taking the pulse of at least some of the people who are going to great lengths to show support for Strickland. Okay. So this first quote from one of these people who's hanging out with him, I think, is pretty tame and neutral, and it says this: "I stand with Bishop Strickland because I've personally met him and prayed with him, and I've been to his mass, and he is a very holy and reverent man of God who is only speaking the truth, and he is trying to help the flock in these confusing times. He is trying to speak the truth." Okay, that's the end of the quote. On its face, I think that sounds great, right? And like I said before, when I talked about having sympathy, I know that's a lot of people's experience of Strickland is as somebody who is really trying to speak the truth clearly and help the flock. Great. Um, Now, this next one is really interesting because it says something about Strickland kind of personally. And this man that they interviewed, he says this. He says, "Quote: The reason I came out is in support of Bishop Strickland. I met him 2 years ago. He came out here 2 years ago. He's the only bishop we could get to pray the rosary with us and knelt down on the brick for 45 minutes, leading the most beautiful rosary I've ever heard." Okay, so That part of the quote is great. It sounds like this guy maybe has come to the bishop's meetings before, and that Bishop Strickland came out of the bishop's meeting and prayed the rosary on the sidewalk with the folks who were there. That's awesome. But then the next thing the guy says is this: he was yanked from being a bishop for telling the truth, for preaching the truth. Okay. So the understanding there is right is that Francis removed Strickland because he's preaching the truth. Get behind that for a second. The implication is that Francis does not want bishops to preach the truth, right? That's what this guy says. Okay. Um, and the last quote is kind of echoing that, and this one was from a whole family that had gathered there, a mother and a father and a number of children. And I think it was the father of the family, if I remember correctly, responded and said this: "We came to the rally first and foremost to support Bishop Strickland for his faithful shepherding. Unfortunately, he's getting punished for being a faithful shepherd to us Catholics." Okay, so again, um, some folks think that Strickland has been removed specifically for being a faithful Catholic. Now, I don't believe that Strickland invited any of these people specifically here. And you certainly cannot fault someone for who shows up, to support them. I would never try to put these things on Bishop Strickland. But another thing that is, I think, worth noting is that Father James Altman was also there supporting Strickland. And if you don't know, Father James Altman is a priest of the Diocese of La Crosse in Wisconsin. And he got in some trouble. I think it was last year, basically for um, being very partisan in his politics. Right? Somebody took a video of him giving a homily saying that that if you're Catholic, you can't vote for a Democrat. Um, Regardless of that, he kind of got in trouble. He was forbidden from preaching publicly. But he has since, this Father Altman has since become a very clear and vocal uh, proponent of the idea that Francis is actually an anti-pope. So Altman, who refused to talk to the pillar in Baltimore when they tried to interview him, he is a clear supporter of the idea that Francis is not the real pope, that he's an anti-pope. Okay, so like I said, I would not blame Strickland for anything said by the folks who show up to support him or show up to pray with him outside the bishop's meetings. I think it is worth asking why he wouldn't go into the bishop's meetings despite the fact that he's allowed to. I don't have an answer. Like, I don't have an answer for that. Um, but it does strike me as a little bit strange. He is still a bishop. He hasn't had his episcopal faculties stripped. He hasn't been forbidden from public preaching or public appearances or anything like that. So why is he not in the meetings? I think that's a good question. Um, so what is going on? What There's clearly some perception out there. And you take it from these quotes that I just read, some of these quotes, but you know, if you kind of survey Catholic Facebook or Catholic Twitter, sorry, Catholic X, formerly known as Catholic Twitter, um, you get quite a few people who mostly already did not like Francis to begin with, sort of painting Strickland as a kind of martyr. Now, I'll say this: I think that Strickland has clearly spoken the truth on issues that it often seems like Francis is not super clear on, right? And I have sympathy with that. Um, on right on sexual ethics, on the place of the church in the world, on certain, been a few things in terms of like the sacraments. And one of the things, obviously, I think we all know that people criticize Francis on is not speaking as clearly or as courageously as they might like on some of these issues. Strickland does speak clearly on those issues, has spoken clearly on those issues, and I have a lot of sympathy with that. And I think that's a real legitimate reason why some people who tend not to sympathize with or understand Francis have kind of latched on to Strickland. Um, but the thing is, without, again, as I said at the top, I don't take sides. I'm not taking sides. It's really not my place since I'm a layman and we're talking about something that's between the Pope and a bishop. Um, but the reality is that Strickland has said things over and above what a faithful, orthodox, courageous bishop might say. So, two examples. He's gotten in trouble. Well, trouble. He's gotten some press for two things really that he did. One of them specifically was on Twitter, and one of them was, I think, started on the Diocese of Tyler website. So the first thing was his famous undermining the deposit of faith quote, right? Um, Bishop Strickland had posted on Twitter, or whatever. I'm just going to say Twitter. Maybe it was X by that point, but everybody knows it as Twitter anyway. Um, Love you, Elon. Much love. But I'm just going to keep calling it Twitter. So he wanted to make it clear that he did not believe Francis was an illegitimate pope. That he did believe Francis was really the pope. But he said in addition to that that he had to speak out against Francis's program of undermining the deposit of faith, right? So let's if we want to understand the implications of that quote, let's define what the deposit of faith is. Okay. So the deposit of faith is this: it is the saving truth revealed by God through scripture and tradition, interpreted by the magisterium, and handed down to future generations of the church by Christ through the apostles. Okay. So the Second Vatican Council wrote a famous document called Dei Verbum that really defined this very well. That said that both scripture and tradition are essential parts of the deposit of faith and that they're interpreted by the magisterium. And the content is everything that God wants us to know for our salvation. Okay, so just back up for a second and think about what Strickland actually said there. He said that Pope Francis, whom he believes is the legitimate pope, uh, is actively trying to undermine the salvation, like the knowledge that God has given to the church in order to save us. Like that is that's quite a statement. Don't you think? Um and frankly, as somebody who's read a lot of Francis, both a lot of his writings and a lot of things that he said, I don't see how that can have any connection with the things that Francis has actually done with his actual words. Because I mean, I'll be honest with you. Um, I have never seen, I've never read anything that Francis said that seemed like it was trying to cut out the saving, like the the words of salvation that God is trying to pass to the faithful through Christ and the apostles. Um, so how do we explain that? It's hard for me to explain that coming actually coming from the mouth or the keys, the typing of a bishop, because I suspect that Bishop Strickland really knows well what the content of the deposit of faith is. Um, so I don't really have an explanation for that, but saying that is directly accusing Francis of basically undermining all of Christian teaching, basically, at least the most important parts of it. Okay. So the other thing was that the other thing that Strickland kind of got in some hot water for was the message that he put out before the synod on synodality opened in Rome. Right. And if you remember, he put out this message that got put on Facebook, passed around Facebook. He put it on the website of the Diocese of Tyler, if I remember correctly, where he basically affirmed the teaching of the church in faith on faith and morals, on issues of faith and morals. And then he made some comments not explicitly tied to the upcoming synod, but he made comments basically uh, lamenting or fearing the possibility that the church was about to go into schism over maintaining its teachings on faith and morals. So, a lot of I know a lot of people who pass this around with great acclaim for it. And the thing is, when you read it on its again, you read it on its face completely out of context, it's a great document. We affirm the traditional teaching of the church, and we don't want the church to go into schism, right? Uh, the problem is that in its context, it was a clear statement about the upcoming synod. Now, again, all of us, we might not necessarily know exactly what synods do. I hope that Bishop Strickland does, but uh, just let's go over for a second what synods actually do. The Synod of Bishops, as it is, right? They have these meetings like they just had, and at the end of the synod, they take votes on certain matters, and they put out documents that they send to the Pope to advise him on whatever the synod is about, right? So a few years ago, we had the synod on the Amazon, and at the end of that, the bishops gathered. They gave a document to Pope Francis that gave their recommendations. And then usually the Pope issues like an exhortation, a synodal exhortation, which responds to the issues that the synod, wanted to discuss. But which, by the way, is not an exercise of papal infallibility. So, in other words, all synods have is a power of consulting and advising the Pope, who is free to take or leave whatever they say and produce a document that may take some of their suggestions or may not. When it came to the Synod on the Amazon, Francis did not accept quite a few of that synod's recommendations or votes. So, really, in context, what Strickland did was suggest that the Pope was convening a body that was going to recommend to him that he do something schismatic, that he jettison the church's teachings on faith and morals, I guess. That we jettison the um, teaching of the church. Now, pause for a second. So, Rob in the chat is asking, Why do you think Strickland is humble and not a Rush Limbaugh type personality? Oh man. Um, taking me back to my childhood of my parents listening to Rush in the car all the time. So, my impression of Strickland as being essentially humble um, comes from basically reading his responses to the controversies that he's been involved in. Now, I don't think that these two things I've described, that accusing Pope Francis of undermining the deposit of faith or of the letter he put out before the synod, I don't think those were particularly humble. Um, but for example, you could compare him to some other controversial church figures. Actually, for example, Father James Altman, the priest who showed up in Baltimore with Bishop Strickland. If you look at Father Altman's Twitter or his Instagram or his like his own website, he basically writes about himself as an extremely inspiring and faithful priest, which I would say not humble. um, or or even somebody like the recently resigned Bishop of Knoxville in Tennessee, who was hounded by his priests and laity, all kinds of problems in the diocese. And after he wasn't exactly forced to resign, he did choose to resign. But after he resigned, he basically went on again, like Twitter, basically defending himself in kind of grandiose terms and publishing these anonymous letters defending him from all kinds of calumny. Um, that I suspect he wrote himself, but whether he wrote them himself or not, he published them. So I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that from Strickland. In response to his removal as bishop, he's basically said, I just want to do what Jesus wants me to do. I'm going to pray. I'm going to be with people, and I'm going to see what comes next. So that's my impression of Strickland. So, but to these things that Strickland has said, right? This message before the synod. These are things like if you really like Strickland, and like I said, I have a lot of sympathy with Strickland. I like Strickland. Uh, I, these are not things that other what we would call orthodox, faithful, courageous bishops would do or have done. Right? Do you want to talk about courageous or faithful bishops in the United States Church? Um, we have we have a few of them, right? Um, Archbishop, I would say Archbishop Gomez, obviously Bishop Barron, Cardinal DiNardo. Um, I would put a plug in for Bishop Peter Jugis in Charlotte, who is kind of quietly one of the, I think, one of the heroes of the American church, and plenty of guys like that, but they don't come out and say that the Pope is undermining the deposit of faith. So here's the big question, though, or one of the bigger questions. What Why was Strickland actually removed? Uh, well, so far the Vatican has not said directly. Now they did perform an apostolic visitation, right, a couple months before the removal, that was carried out by a couple of bishops from Texas, um, in that area, and which so Cardinal DiNardo commented on this and said that that visitation examined every aspect of governance and pastoring in the diocese. And that after that visitation, quote unquote, top cardinals in the Vatican, whoever those are, recommended to Francis that he try to get Strickland to resign. Now, one of the criticisms I think can be legitimately leveled about this is the lack of transparency so far. Um, I, let's be clear, like canonically, theologically, it is part of his rightful power to remove a bishop. I would just suggest that maybe it would be a good idea in today's day and age, the way news travels and the way people talk about things all over the world, to be a little bit more transparent. So I think that is quite possibly a legitimate criticism of the removal, is that it hasn't been super transparent because they haven't really said why he was removed. Was he removed because of those things he said? I would suspect not directly. Um, but they may have factored in, but there has been some news, and I don't know all I don't I'm not an expert on everything going on in the diocese of Tyler, Texas, but if you do a little bit of reading, again, especially I think on the Pillar, which does a great job reporting on this stuff, it it sounds like there are quite possibly some pretty strange things going on there. Um, Not least is this weird story about attempts to found a kind of Catholic, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a kind of Catholic commune paradise in the middle of Texas that's been beset by all kinds of financial fraud. There's that. There's a variety of other things that sound like they could be pretty irregular. Now, a would I like to have an exact list of reasons why Strickland is deposed? Yes, I would. We don't have that, so that's what we've got right now. Now, one of the major objections, or not objections exactly, but one of the major things I could hear people saying would be saying, all right, so if Francis didn't depose Strickland because of his orthodoxy, why is Francis not going around deposing heterodox bishops? Right? Why is he not? Isn't this evidence that Francis has a problem with traditional teaching, or has a problem that Francis is opposed to, uh, you know, courageously, vocally speaking out in favor of faith and morals, etc. Uh, and I would respond to that. I would respond to that in two ways. One, um, you know, you follow the news. He's not going on a crusade of just mass deposals of Orthodox bishops either. Uh, as I said before, not just in the United States, but really all around the world, there are bishops. I think of Athanasius Schneider. I think of, you know, well, not just Schneider. Let me back off of that for just a second. But there are bishops all around the world that I think speak the truth of the gospel just as clearly as Strickland. And Francis is not hunting them down and deposing them. Now, if over the next couple of years that starts happening, then maybe we could take that as evidence that Francis has a program of punishing the faithful and the orthodox. The big question that I think a lot of people are asking, and I know I've asked this, is what about the situation in Germany, right? If Francis is willing to come into Texas and depose Strickland for whatever offenses it is that he's committed, whether it's his challenging the authority of the Pope, or, well, not exactly challenging the authority, whether it's basically accusing Francis of undermining the faith, whether it is saying that the synod was schismatic, um, or whether it's all these governance, maybe it's governance and financial issues in his diocese. Why isn't he going into Germany and cleaning house? I mean, the bishops in Germany, like, if you don't follow it in detail, like, they're on the edge. Like, they're really on the edge of taking the German church into schism, I think. And I think it is partially, it's a legitimate question. Um, but I think there's another very good explanation for it. I think Francis knows. Well, to start with, if you read what Francis has said and what the cardinals in the Vatican have said about the situation in Germany, Francis has been very clear that what is going on in Germany is not cool, that this is not what synodality means, uh, that they are essentially threatening schism, that we don't vote on Catholic teaching on faith and morals, that we don't just he has accused the German bishops of basically uh, trying to turn the Catholic message into the message of the world, right? Um, so he's spoken out very clearly against what the German bishops are doing. Now, but why hasn't he removed any of them? And I think the answer is basically that he realizes that they are already so close to schism, that they are already so close to taking themselves and taking Germany essentially out of communion with the Catholic Church, that I suspect that he thinks that behind the scenes, maybe somewhat more subtle, a more subtle strategy is the one that is more likely to result in greater benefit for the faithful, or at least less harm to the faithful, right? Um, so you know that how is he handling the situation in Germany? You know, I think that we're going to have to wait and kind of see what happens in upcoming months, years, possibly what happens in Germany. Um, you heard it here first. I think we're going to see basically a schism in our lifetime. I don't think the synod is going to cause it. I don't think it's going to be in America. I think it's going to be in Germany. I think most of the German church is going to go into schism. Guess what, folks? We've seen that before. Ha ha ha. There's a little Reformation joke for you. Um, so, to kind of wrap up my thoughts about this, you know, we may anyone out there is free to like Bishop Strickland, and like I said, I have a lot of sympathy with him and with his supporters. I think he, at times when it can be hard to figure out what Francis is really trying to say, Strickland is very clear. And for those of us who are interested in evangelizing the world with the clear message of the gospel, with like the richness of the faith, um, that's really comforting. Uh, and I think it's also worth saying that despite what Strickland has done, excuse me, um, despite what Strickland has done, we as the laity are free to agree with or disagree with it, right? According to our state in life and according to our like vocation. So that's okay. Uh, Patrick, I'll get to your comment in just a second. I got a comment in the chat that I want to get to, but so it's okay to like to say I think Francis is overstepping his bounds. Not overstepping his bounds. It's okay to say I think Francis is making a bad decision, right? It's even okay to think that his sympathies lie elsewhere, right? We know that. I mean, his theological sympathies and his pastoral sympathies, we know that they tend to lie with bishops like Kupich, and not so much with bishops like Strickland. Okay, and that's all right. Like we can see that. Um, what I think though is I think that going to the point where you're saying that Francis is trying to persecute people who are faithful or people who are orthodox. And I think trying to say that Francis deposed Strickland because he's too orthodox is completely going outside of the evidence. is letting a spirit of partisanship overrule basically a look at the evidence. Um, and frankly, I think that if that was Francis's program, okay, sure, maybe Strickland would be the first American he would remove. But if the conspiracy theorists are right, then we will see a whole series of further removals pretty soon, right? Because he'd have to get rid of other bishops who speak out clearly the truth. Okay. And frankly, in America, there are quite a few of those. So, yeah. So in relation to the Germany thing, Patrick wrote in the chat that the Vatican permitted a letter that he wrote, and I assume you mean Francis, that he wrote to some theologians to be made public. It's one of the clearest things he's said about Germany so far. Right. Man, this Germany thing, it's if you stay up at night worrying that Francis, like, if you just listen to Francis's detractors, okay, and you stay up at night worrying that Francis is just letting everything go bananas, go and read some of the stuff that's been going on with Germany. Uh, because I mean, it's infuriating, honestly, the way the German bishops respond to what he says, because Francis has repeatedly, as well as other Vatican officials, repeatedly come out and said, "This is not okay. Don't do this. This is not synodality. The church isn't up to a vote." Excuse me. Sorry to cough into my gaming headset. Right? They've repeatedly come out and said those things, and then the German bishops basically go back to Germany and say, "Oh, everything is great. We agree. Like we in Rome agree on everything." It's a pretty infuriating PR campaign, I think. so um, so yeah, I don't this Strickland thing. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens next. Here, I've got my Belmont Abbey College alumni mug to put on show on the live stream. It's just that the alumni part is on the wrong side of the mug, so there's my red mug. Um, yeah, but that I think is just going far beyond the evidence to say anything like that Francis is persecuting the Orthodox and the faithful and the traditional. I don't think people read Francis enough. I don't think they read what he writes or what he says enough. And the same probably was true during the pontificates of John Paul and Benedict, right? Everyone accused Benedict, people opposed to Benedict accused him of being some kind of vicious, brutal monster going around squashing theological freedom. And all that means is that they didn't really read the things that he said or wrote. And a lot of people aren't doing that with Francis either. So, all right. Well, I think that about wraps it up. Been here 49 minutes. I hope I've been able to bring a little bit of theology, history, common sense to this. Thank you guys for joining me. This video is going to go up on YouTube. If you're watching this recorded, leave comments, like, subscribe. I'll be back in 2 weeks, right here, same time, same channel, to discuss more events in the church. I am Dr. Ben Safranski, and let's all pray for the unity of the church and try to bring a little common sense to the world. Peace.